In this video, we're going to look at Integrity's Knowledge Capture AP Lite solution. The graphic on the screen at the moment represents the workflow that our invoice will pass through in order to be paid. The first stage is to take receipt of the invoice, and this could be either via an electronic copy, which could be an email attachment, or it could be a hard copy, which has been then scanned into the system and the data taken from it. Stage 2 is to match our supplier. So here we're going to take the supplier information from our invoice and automatically look it up against our supplier database. If we're happy that the supplier matches, we can then move on to stage 3, which is to match the PO. Now this could either be a manual process or it could be automatic from the system. And here we're going to check that our PO number on any previously created purchase order matches that on the invoice. Our shipping address and items also match, as well as the invoice amounts and purchase order amounts. Once the account department is happy that the PO and invoices match, we then move to the approval stage, and this would be done out with the accounts department. So we would send an email notification to either the team leader or perhaps a manager, and they would then be prompted to log into the system to validate any invoices within their delegation level. Finally, the accounts team would take charge of the process again and pay the invoice on stage 6. Moving on now to take a look at the software itself. We're now looking at Integrity's Accounts Payable Lite solution. On the left-hand side of the screen, we can see all of the potential work baskets that our invoice will pass through as it moves through the workflow process. So we have, for instance, our supplier check, match PO, pay invoice, and we also have some exceptions. So if, for instance, the supplier was rejected or the invoice was rejected, there's work baskets for those as well. However, as a user, I can manage the entire process from my search in basket at the bottom of the list on the left-hand side here. And from within my search in basket, I can see any invoices that are waiting to be processed. And importantly, from the step name, I can actually see where in the process flow it is. So I can quickly identify what the invoice is and where it is within the workflow. I also have access to other metadata relating to the invoice, so the time it was created, invoice date, I have amount, invoice number, received, and I also have my supplier information on this screen as well. If we click into the invoice, we'll be able to see that at the top of the screen we have a prompt which helps the user if they're unsure of what to do at this particular stage of the process. So here I can see that I'm being prompted to validate that this is actually an invoice and move it through into the next stage of the process. Again, we have our metadata, so I can see the invoice amount, the supplier information, etc. as we looked at within the search view. I can also click into this attachments tab. So here I can actually see the invoice itself. Again, I have some metadata surrounding the document, and I can double click into the PDF and actually open up the document itself. Now that I have my document open, I can see, or I can check information on the invoice. So I can highlight, for instance, the purchase order number. We also have our total amount. We might also want to look at any line items within the document. Once I'm happy that this is an invoice and it's ready to move on to the next stage, I move back to my document screen and I will hit approve at this stage. The system will now check against the supplier database automatically, and if the supplier matches from the invoice in our database, we move on to the check PO section. Now that the screen is refreshed, I can see that my invoice has moved into the check PO section of the workflow. So the system has looked up our supplier, validated that the supplier is valid within our database, and pushed the invoice on to the next stage. If the supplier wasn't found, it would have been pushed into reject supplier work basket. I can now click into the document, and again I'm going to look at our attachments tab, and as well as our original invoice, we'll now see that the system has actually gathered any generated purchase orders that were previously in the system. And again, I can click into the purchase order and actually open up the document and check that against our invoice. So we now have our previously created invoice and also our purchase order, which the system has now found for us. And again, I can highlight any areas that we want to check. So we have our purchase order number, for example, and if I scroll down, I can see our total order number is 149 as it was on the invoice. So we can be sure that here the invoice and the purchase orders match, and we're happy with that, and we're ready to push this through to approval. So as the accounts rep, I've checked the invoice, I've checked the purchase order. Again, I have my data from the document and my prompt at the top of the screen. Everything here is I'm happy with, so I'm simply going to hit approve and push this through to approval. And what will happen now is that the system will generate a notification via email, which will go out to any managers or any team leaders which have validation and a delegation level to approve invoices for payment. And we can look at an example of that if I move to my email client. So we can see that action required, there's an invoice waiting approval. I'm prompted with a link to log into the system, and there I'll be able to see any items that are sitting within my own work basket for approval. And there is multiple levels of approval as well. So as we'll see in our example, in this instance, there's 2 sign-offs required before the invoice will return back into the accounts department and ready to be paid. Again, I've refreshed the screen. We can see that the invoice is now at manager approval. And as I'm an administrator, I have access to this document. If I was the accounts team, at this stage, I wouldn't be able to go in and actually sign off on this document. So this would be driven by user level permissions. And as I'm signed in as the administrator, I can actually push this process through. So as the manager for approval, I would go through the same process as we have done previously. I can come in and look at the documents, look at them side by side, as we did in the previous stage. And once happy with them, I can hit approve. Or if I had some query or question that I had to route the invoice back to the accounts team, I can also do that. Or if for some reason I wanted to reassign it to another manager, I also have those options as well. In our example, we're going to say we're satisfied with the approval level of the invoice, and I'm going to push that through. So that would then go to a second manager for approval, who would then go through the same process. And this approval stage can be customized. So if you have 2 or 3 approvals within the business, or you have a single approver at this stage, or it's dependent on the value of the invoice, that can all be taken into consideration and built into this particular workflow. So again, just moving through the same process, I would check against the documents. This is the second level approver this time. I'm going to hit approve. At this stage, the invoice would be returned to the accounts department and would be ready to be paid using any third-party applications that may be used for invoice payment. And this really concludes the process for the invoices at this stage. We can see that the invoice document has arrived into pay invoice, and this again allows me to go and look at the document and finish off the workflow from within the accounts payable solution. So the prompt, arrange for payment to be made to the supplier, and we can press pay invoice and bring the process to conclusion.